Welcome to the Voices of Healthcare Equity. I'm Kim Tranquata, founder and CEO of the Healthcare Alliance for an Equitable World, and your host on this journey. Our organization, driven by clinicians, is on a mission to address global healthcare inequity using telehealth solutions. Together, we're building a community of healthcare professionals committed to making a scalable impact on global equity. Join me in insightful conversations with global health innovators as we explore the current and future state of healthcare. Be a part of this mission. Let's create lasting change together. Today, it is my great pleasure to introduce Dr. Nwando Anyaoku. Dr. Anyaoku is a physician executive, TEDx speaker, author, and executive coach. We have connected around our shared interests in physician leadership and global health equity. And it is my great pleasure to welcome you to the podcast, Dr. Anyaoku.
Thank you so much for having me.
Oh, my pleasure. Before we begin our conversation, I always like to offer our guest a chance to add any disclaimers with affiliates or needs to identify any conflicts of interest.
I have no conflicts to report.
Pleasure. All right. Let's start with you, Dr. Anyaoku. Tell us a little about your background and how you became involved in medicine and health equity.
Ooh, well, it's an interesting conversation always to have because it makes you go back down the journey. I was born in West Africa and went to medical school in Nigeria. And in my course of my medical training, I was always interested in the state of the world's children, which was the title of the UNICEF publication that came out every year at that point. And that inspired me into a career in medicine and in pediatrics and public health. When I graduated, I lived briefly in the Caribbean, and then I came to the United States and did a master's in public health, and eventually did a residency in pediatrics. And so I've had a career of over 2 decades of clinical care for children and their families, and along the way, really was inspired to become a physician leader because I felt it was important for physicians to guide our destiny, quite honestly, the way we're able to practice and care for one another as physicians and for our patients and communities. So I've been a physician executive, physician leader for many years. I also found myself in a position of coaching and mentoring, as you can imagine, as a leader over those years, but with a particular place in my heart for underrepresented minority clinicians who had a particularly challenging path to go. And that, you know, stayed with me. And I had the opportunity to serve as coach to a number of them, of people over the years. So I moved from the East Coast, where I had started my US journey, to the West Coast a few years ago, just under a decade, and led a pediatrics enterprise for a large healthcare system in the greater Seattle area. Um, and in the wake of the pandemic, when people finally recognized the joint syndemic of COVID pandemic and the recognition of racism as a public health problem, we really made a commitment to addressing health equity. And I became the inaugural Chief Health Equity Officer for our organization and have been in that space for the last few years. And part of that work is thinking about how to advance the diversification of our clinical workforce as a health equity strategy. And that informed my choice and my call to become an executive coach in order really to support um, a diverse population of physicians. Tiny, tiny snapshot of my journey.
Yes, you have had quite a career and quite a journey, and I appreciate how difficult it is to capture that in a short introduction. Um, So you started your journey in West Africa, did med school in Nigeria, was inspired by the world's children and the need to make healthcare particularly better for children, and became a pediatrician. Have worked in all kinds of places, so the Caribbean, East Coast, West Coast, and now find yourself in a position of trying to make the whole system work better for women, underrepresented minorities. And I think I can appreciate why that's important, but I'd like to bring that back to you to tell us why that is important to creating the healthcare future we want to see.
I think that a lot of us, especially as women, underestimate the importance of our voices at the table. Our voices as leaders, as physicians, as caregivers, as generally the CEOs of our home and decision makers, and the importance of being able to connect to those people who are also making these decisions on an everyday basis. You know, having that diversity of lived experience and understanding of how people have to navigate professional life, um, family life, and all those different parts of us as women and as leaders really is an important skill set to bring to the leadership table, um, because it changes the conversation, right? You can have a different conversation when you have those different lenses. And in my journey, I've started out in a place where all of the leadership was male, and watched it transition as women started to find our voices and step up and say, you know, we have something to say about this. But I also found that, you know, that stepping up requires support. Women leaders require other women leaders to say, I see you, I hear you, and to amplify and support one another and give each other the confidence really to step forward and fully be present as we should. And in the particular case of underrepresented women, especially Black women, African American women, there's there's a particular level of challenge that seems to show up more in this space. Not, you know, I tell people there is no Olympics for who's most oppressed, but this is the space in which I live, so I can absolutely speak to that. And so you'll find that a lot of African American women leaders find themselves in a space where you come in and initially you're celebrated as the newcomer, and very quickly the things that make you different start to be held against you. And so you're either considered aggressive or not a team player because you don't engage in the same way as people, you know, the majority might expect you to. So that starts to be an additional mental burden in the body of work that we're trying to get done. And the you know it can really undermine your confidence and your willingness to actually show up every day and find yourself questioned about your qualifications, your very presence, right? And I felt like, having navigated that space, that I had a unique lens and offering of support to give to women who've experienced that in their physician leadership journey and in their path to build a whole complete life for themselves.
Dr. Anyaoku, what you're doing, of course, is so important for those women and those leaders who find themselves alone and probably questioning whether they're in the right place or doing the right thing. I ponder this issue of physician leadership quite a bit, and I think about why is it so hard for physicians to assume leadership positions when they come available. And there is something about the probably the selection of physicians in the first place. And secondly, the training that we undergo that makes us good little followers and really leads us to suppress our own leadership and our own sense of what's right and wrong. Um, have you experienced that in the people that you mentor?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, physician leadership, I used to describe it as herding cats. And really, it had there are a number of unique challenges in that space, some of which you've identified, which is our selection. We tend to be perfectionists. We want to get everything right. We have to, we spend the first part of our lives trying to excel, to stand out, to be selected into medical school, into training, right? So all of that work is kind of is me work. It's not we work. And so that's the first place you get into. And then you get into medical school, which is very hierarchical, right? You learn, you follow, and you become a part of the pathway. But then at the end of the day, you assume also ultimate responsibility, right? So whatever else anybody else does, you are ultimately responsible, which makes it difficult, A, to give up your perfectionism, but also to cede power to anyone else because you're like, well, if they don't do it right, I'm on the hook for that. And that whole mindset is almost diametrically opposite to what is required to be a leader. To be a leader, now you have to learn how to work with a team, how to delegate, how to trust other people, and to yield different aspects of the work. That's not just a toolkit that we were given in our medical training. And so when we're going through and these positions become available, you're immediately thinking about the worst possible outcome and how you'll be responsible for it. And it really requires intentional education and coaching and support to pivot from being the doctor on the line for everything to the leader of the team, and yet you must be the leader of the team because you know why. You know all the different aspects. And it's incredibly valuable to have your perspective as a physician leading a team that's delivering healthcare. And so, so it's how do we give physicians the toolkit that they need to make that pivot to from MD totally clinically responsible to leader of a team and working with others and amplifying other voices and developing other people so that you have the whole becomes greater than the sum of its parts. That's not typically the way that we are trained as physicians, and you'll find that in institutions people are selected as leaders because they have the biggest patient panel, because they have the best reviews, right? They have the well, all the things that help you do those things are not the things that make you a leader. Right? Having more patience is a whole different mindset from the mindset it takes to become a leader, and so that dynamic tends to be challenging. And not that having big patients precludes you, but you actually have to actively develop a different mindset in order to become a leader.
You're in a realm that I love speaking about now. Um, and that brings us to the difference between management and leadership. It is a difference that most leaders don't understand as they move up the chain because they tend to be high performers who become managers and then perhaps get into leadership role, and those things are very different, management and leadership. And even the leaders don't necessarily understand when they've put somebody in a leadership role. They usually expect them to do both, be a manager and a leader at the same time. And those are things that frequently come into conflict. So I'd love to hear a little more about that. And then I want to also circle back to the idea of the personal responsibility physicians bring.
Absolutely. There is a quite distinct difference between a manager and a leader. And to your point, because we are trained to be good little followers, we tend to manage what is already a set of expectations, right? So a manager advances somebody else's vision. Who you have X amount of metrics you have to meet. So let's do all the things we need to do to meet that. You have we're advancing someone else's vision, keeping the trains on time, getting people vacation, sick time, covering details. A leader is a different level. A leader inspires others to develop, to think of different ways of doing their job better. You're not you are setting the vision, and you are inspiring others to come along with you for the journey. And so that's not to say that you're still not going to deliver high quality safe patient care, but you're thinking about how do you strengthen your team so that you're doing the most impactful work, you're bringing the best way of serving your patients and your community. It requires a different level of self direction and self empowerment to be a leader, to call out, to look at a certain situation and think about new ways to do it and be able to communicate that vision and have people follow you on that path. It's hard to be a leader if no one is following you. But a leader is quite a bit different from a manager, and it is a challenge. I find that a lot of physician leaders get in place, and the first thing they're thinking is that they're going to defend their team, i.e., other physicians, from the suits. And it takes a while for you to understand, no, your role is to figure out how to make the whole work, right? Because at the end of the day, we all have the same goal, even if we come at it differently, right? If you bring your passion and your commitment to care to serve patients to this place, but the lights are off and the doors are locked, well, then there's nowhere for you to carry out what it is you need to do. So understanding that we're all working towards the same goal helps us to bring our agency into play in that space. But there are definitely two different lenses, that of a manager versus that of a leader.
Thank you for bringing that out a little more for everyone. I do think we run into that a lot. And you mentioned how physicians, when they are in leadership, they bring a personal responsibility lens. That goes back to all our training, right? Where we actually take an oath, an ethical oath, to to have the patient's best interests be our fiduciary responsibility. I have to say, I think that is the superpower of physician leadership. Non physicians in leadership don't carry that burden, but they also don't carry that responsibility. And I think when you have a physician in the room, regardless of if they're working clinically actively or they're separated from clinically active practice, they carry that fiduciary responsibility to the client, the customer, the patient in everything they do. And that's part of the sickness that we're suffering um, in healthcare when we lose that, when patients lose that. Medicine's a sacred trust that can't be carried out only when it's profitable and when it's in the best interest of the company. Tell me your thoughts.
Ooh. Oh yes. I I think it is so important that you call that out because we tend to just skip past it and assume it's a given. But it makes a world of difference when the person making the decisions sits the patient in the room first, right? Whatever else we're doing, it's about the patient. All the other details don't matter if we can't serve our patients safely with high quality in a way that they feel like we honored that sacred trust of our encounter with them. And so for physicians, that is first and foremost, that's the first thing in the room. I remember working in an organization where the non-clinical leaders would have their meetings and they brought a chair, like a folding chair, and they wrote patient on it. And for them, that was their way of bringing the patient into the room. Well, as a physician leader, I don't need a chair. That patient is in my heart and in my mind every single time. So you can do the math and tell me that this is not profitable, but it doesn't matter if, to me, that's not the first thing. The first thing is how does it serve my patient? So I don't need a chair in the room to remind me that the patient is the most important voice there. And as I do my work now, really focusing on underrepresented communities, I I make sure we bring their voice into the room. What's important to them? How do they show up? What we've learned about quality and reducing variability, but people don't come out of cookie cutters. People are different, and people have different life circumstances and social determinants or drivers that impact their health. Bringing all of that into the conversation is critical to be able to effectively serve the patient. That responsibility lies heavy on our hearts as physicians. And so we always have to have that, and we do have it in front of us. when I mentioned personal responsibility earlier, I was really talking more about the mechanics of people making decisions, right? And thinking, well, if I make this call and something goes wrong, right? How am I going to feel personally, right? Be responsible for it personally or legally. um, so it is a challenge, and yet, to your point, it is in fact the superpower of physician leaders.
With that awesome ending, oh, so inspirational. We're going to take a brief break and return in the second half for more conversation with Dr. Wando Anyaoku.